Hello, everybody. This is Michael Broussard. Welcome to Survivor Stories. Our guest today is Patricia Wennell, who has written an amazing book called Because It Didn't Stop When It Ended, about her therapy journey after abuse. Um, if during the presentation there are any questions you want to ask Patricia, the way that you do that, you go down to the bottom of your Zoom window. You click where it says Q&A, type in your question or your comment, and I will periodically check those and read them off to Patricia so she can respond. If you do not see Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window, click where it says More, the three dots, and then click on Q&A, and then it will appear. Patricia, welcome to Survivor Stories.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for having me and for offering this wonderful platform for survivors. It's great. Thank you.
I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your willingness to actually share your story because that takes a lot and it's very healing for other survivors. To kick things off, I want to ask you to tell us about the abuse you experienced in as much or as little detail as you choose.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean there's a lot I could say, but I think if I start off in a way that I introduced this story in my book, which is that our early childhood, my siblings and mine, early childhood was really quite positive. And in the UK, we use a term called good enough parenting, or it's a well-known term. And basically, social workers would see if a parent's a good enough parent, they wouldn't need to intervene. And I would say the early first 6 years of my childhood would have fitted into that more or less, although my mum was quite unpredictable and she did shout a lot, but kind of, I think we would have sat in that box of good enough parenting. But as I got to 6, 7, and onwards, my mother's mental health became a problem. And I didn't understand that as a child, that that's what it was. When she attacked, was very violent, said awful, called me awful names, things like ugly when you cry, if you don't stop crying, sniveling, I'll give you something to cry for. She went as far as strangulation, or not fully, obviously, because I'm still here, but she went as far as that in her state, which was horrendous for a small child that was used to a mostly loving mother. All four siblings, all of us, suffered at the hands of our mum. And our dad was a kind of passive kind of person. He worked away a lot, so he wasn't around. When he was around, our mum used to scream and say, these little bastards have been really bad. You need to smack them. And he would then punish us rather than say, I've been away all week. So that was our childhood. But as mum deteriorated, in addition to the violence and the shouting and the cruelty, came also neglect. And during the time of that neglect, a person came into our lives who offered our parents a kind of get out. I actually feel that he groomed them. And although they were young adults, I don't think they understood what was happening. And he would offer to take myself and another sibling off to go and do some nice things like swimming pool or fishing and all sorts of things. And he was great. He was like the favorite uncle, the best person you could ever want in your life. And I adored him. Very gradually, he began to expose himself in a kind of way that didn't shock. It would be, oops, I haven't put my underwear on properly. It would be that kind of exposure. And then that moved on to the most perverse, horrendous, awful sexual abuse for a period of over 2 years. And one of the interesting things about it is that when I was staying at his home one weekend with a sibling, I can't remember what really upset me, but something really frightened me while I was there. And there was enough to frighten me all the time, but this was a particular thing that must have really frightened me. And I decided I was going to run home. And as I started to run home, it's about a mile and a half from where I lived. As I started, and I'm kind of 9, 10 years old, as I started to run home, between myself and the road I needed to go to was a street homeless person. and he looked very dirty and very disheveled. And I stopped in my tracks, looked at him, and ran back to the abuser. And it wasn't till a lot later in therapy that the therapist, I said, why did I run back there? I don't even know why I ran away, but why did I run back there? And she said, well, I'd explained to her about my home life, and it was so squalid that she said that I described the person that abused me as, apart from the sexual abuse, everything else, he was kind, fun, caring, never shouted at me, never hit me. He did other awful things. But he offered a warmth that I wasn't getting from my mum, and my dad was never there, or he wasn't there very often. And so it was interesting because the therapist said she felt that I'd come up against like an image of what I'd be running back to. The dirt and the squalid condition was represented by this street homeless man, poor man, but I mean, that's kind of as a small child. And I went back to the abuser's house, and it's quite hard to understand that, but I think she gave quite a helpful explanation. So the abuse stopped when Ernest, the abuser, died. And he actually died by the bins. He was a caretaker and he died by the bins. And at the time, I was devastated because he was such a positive, lovely influence in my life, as well as this terrible abuse. Whereas my mum was completely out of control and was cruel all of the time, which is a pretty awful legacy from a parent. But so he died suddenly. I was devastated when he died. And my mother said, I don't think I'm going to let you go to the funeral because you're so upset. And I had to know that he was dead. I had to know he had really died, but I didn't understand that as a child, and I couldn't verbalize that to my mum, couldn't tell anybody what he'd been doing to me. And I didn't go to the funeral, so there was a part of me that felt that he was still around and he hadn't really died. And he said to me, if you tell anyone, they won't believe you. You'll be taken away from your mum. I mean, you'd think a kid who was being abused by the mum, the way she was behaving, might want to be taken away from mum, but that's not how it works for children, I don't think, generally. And I didn't want to be taken away from my mum, and I would have these recurrent nightmares where she'd be standing with her arms folded as I was being driven away in a lorry, and her anger that she would express through her eyes, which was the scariest thing before an attack, that anger and that cruelty that was there, she would be looking at me like that as I was being driven away from her. So, I mean, it just was so silencing and frightening. So after he died, it kind of almost like everything died when he died. I knew what had happened to me. I knew all the details. I knew what my mum had done to me. But she had had some inpatient treatment for over a year and had had the help she needed. And she began to become stable. So the paedophile Ernest had died. My mum became more stable. My mum and dad divorced. She remarried, and my stepdad was more. He was good with my sister and I, but he had no time for my older brothers. But so he was around as a support, and he had boundaries, and he made us go to school. So I just didn't go to school. I felt at odds, and I carried all of that pain. But it wasn't really pain. It was numb. I carried that freeze within me all of my life, and I didn't understand what it was that meant I knew I didn't react like other people reacted, and I didn't seem to be able to feel the way other people felt. And that was my life until I reached the age of 45 years old, when I then entered some therapy. So there's a lot I could say, but it's probably not necessary for me to go into detail about the abuse, just an overview, really. Um, but things did get better at home. The last time my mum attacked me, I was almost 14 years old, and she strangled me until I passed out because I stole some of my stepdad's alcohol and I lied about it. And my school friend was with me, and she screamed my mum's name really loud, and that's what I heard. My mum let go of me when that as that scream came. I heard the end of this scream, and it wasn't till later my friend told me that she'd screamed at my mum to let me go because I'd fainted. Um, but that was the last time. She probably frightened herself, but that was the last time she attacked me. It's the last time she was cruel to me. Um, so it's very confusing for a child to go through that. Um, and then you're left with the impact of it, living with trauma, but not understanding that that's what it is.
That's there's a lot to unpack, right? Um, like always happens, I think, when two survivors talk. A lot of it was on repeat for me. Not all of it, but a lot of it was on repeat for me. I had an abusive, violently and mentally abusive mother. Um, and the thing you said about strangulation, she didn't strangle me. She tried to smother me many times, all the way up into my teens. But when the person who was abusing me said, if you tell somebody, they'll take you away, that scared me too, just like you're saying. And I think that I feel like sometimes people who've never dealt with trauma, they want to kind of get everything in a nice, clean, neat box. You were being abused, so you wanted to leave, period. If you didn't want to leave, then you must not have been abused. And I think that's the thing that I appreciate you being here today to relate this and help more people understand this and what it's about. Um, so you talked a bit about your therapist, and this is what your book is about, right?
Yeah.
Um, you got into therapy, and you said in your 40s now. That same thing happened to me. I got into trauma-informed therapy in my 40s. I was in other kinds of therapy earlier, did no good. But I got into trauma-informed therapy in my 40s. Can you tell me about your early sessions with your therapist, how you grew to trust her?
I mean, it was an interesting experience to have because I actually went into those therapy sessions at first with my partner, who's also a survivor of all sorts of abuse, including sexual abuse. And we had embarked on some therapy to kind of try and help save our relationship because it was really difficult to have a life together with a lot of baggage. Shed loads of baggage is how I describe it. So I started with couple therapy and I met Hilary, my therapist, through that couple therapy. But 19 months into that therapy relationship, it became apparent that my partner wasn't really ready for couple therapy and actually needed some of his own therapy. And I realized I was so ready for therapy. So after some discussion, he said he didn't want to continue. And Hilary offered to see me as an individual on a one-to-one basis, which was amazing. And I actually, during the therapy in the couple sessions, thought Hilary preferred my partner to me. And I found it quite difficult because I felt like I haven't got a voice. He seems to be getting all of the attention. And we had a discussion about that later on, but she and I had a discussion about that later on. But then when I started therapy with her, just me, it was a really strange experience because there was this person now just focusing on me
Mhm.
and not doing what I felt was her focusing more on my partner.
Mhm.
And so I already had a relationship with her, but it was one where I didn't trust her and I didn't think she particularly liked me. But I thought maybe that's more about me than her, and I'm going to give this a go. So we began by really me sharing details and going into a lot of detail and almost telling her in the third person, not connected to myself in any way. But I didn't really know how to connect with myself in that way. So I just told her the story in great detail. So she obviously heard the full story. Um, and I don't think there was very much that I couldn't tell her within the first few months. the biggest problem for me was being able, and I could express anger. That wasn't hard. That was my default emotion, anger. And
Mhm.
anger had driven me to be successful and helped me to get through. So I was good with anger. But what I wasn't good with and still struggle with is the vulnerability and the tears. So the anger was protecting this little deep inner crust, and inside of that inner crust was this tiny child. And I gradually learned about that as I started to connect with myself. And the question Hilary asked me, which to this day I absolutely love, was when you look back at yourself as that small child who was abused, what do you see? And I just stared at her blank. And after a while, I said, I don't see a child. I only see an adult me. So she asked me to bring photographs of myself at that age and my children at that age. My own children are all girls. My partner's children is a boy and a girl. So this is photos of my children who were the similar age to me when I was being abused. And I did that the following session. I went back and I very proudly put photographs of my children and said how beautiful they are and and how much I love them. And that was easy. Then she said, so what about Trisha? What about this little girl?
Mhm.
And I said, I hate her. And I didn't even know that that's how I felt about myself. I honestly didn't know. And I was so shocked. And Hilary looked at me and she said, you hate her? And I said, yeah. Um, so then we started the whole piece of work on me finding how about the little girl that I was before I was abused? What about that little girl? Well, I didn't hate her. I
Mhm.
didn't blame her. So that was easier to go back to the very little me, the tiny little me that was 6, 7. Um, and actually, up until I was about 9, until the sexual abuse, I think I could feel more compassion in the early stages of therapy for that small child. But trying to find compassion for the child that was sexually abused, that also touched Ernest. He was into the weirdest things and taught me how to torture him as a child of 9. And so I believed that I was a bad, naughty, dirty, evil child because that's what my mum had said, and
Yeah.
ugly. Um, that's especially when I cried. You look so ugly when you cry. That's what she said. Um, so I believed all of that. So when Ernest sexually abused me, I felt even dirtier and I felt more bad, worse than my mum could ever say I was. And I think that's where I blamed the 9-year-old me.
Self-blame is something that I know I went through, and I've heard so many survivors talk about blaming themselves because they feel that they had a hand, they had a choice, which of course is not true, as we learned later on in life, is, there's a power dynamic and the choices aren't made by the victim. How did you actually, I'm going to ask you a question in a moment. Before I do that, I'm going to check the question that we have here from one of our attendees. From Joan, the mixed messages from your abuser must have sent you going round in circles. 1 minute abuse, next minute care. Even when he was gone, there must have been a certain amount of guilt about feeling relieved that he had died.
That's interesting because when he died, I wasn't in touch with relief. I was in touch with the devastation of him dying and leaving me. But I was relieved because I needed to make sure he was dead. And I think, that I wanted the relief, but I didn't get the relief because I didn't go to his funeral.
Hmm.
So I didn't see him dead. And the last time I saw him, he was well. The next minute, he's dead. That doesn't work for a child of 11.
Yeah.
Um, so so it's a mix. It's a lot harder speaking now as an adult to the mind of a child and a very wounded
Hmm.
hurting child or frozen child. Um, but yes, it was very confusing. And you know, one of the worst things, and this kind of gets me when I talk about it, I would, when he wanted me to do things to him, I would pleasure him to the best of my ability. And I would really try hard. And it was much like I tried hard with my mum. I would be as good as I could be. I would help her. I would look after her. Everything I could do to stop her attacking me and hurting me and calling me these horrible names. And it's the same with Ernest. I thought if I do this really well, he won't ask me again because it'll be good enough. And it's quite a bizarre as an adult looking at that. But as the child, through the child's mind and the child's eyes, it was if you if you get all your sums right, they stop putting red pen, they give you a tick and you move on,
Right.
right? So that's what I was trying to achieve in my little child mind with my mum and with Ernest. And of course, it didn't work for either of them. Um, so it was confusing. I was used to the chaos of my mum laughing with me one minute, attacking me the next. I was used to doing, even before I was 6 or 7, I was used to climbing on a wall one day and her holding my hand and joining in, not climbing the wall, but, holding my hand and joining in with my fun, to the next day slapping me on the back of the legs because I'd walked on a wall. So I had that chaos in my home life. And Ernest, it was familiar.
Hmm.
That's what home life's like.
Yeah.
And then the contrast to all of this is that I would then be at my grandparents, who were very middle class business people, sang opera, spoke French as well as English, educated, had, they were very, they had a status in society, my grandparents, and they were very Victorian in their views, and everything was structured and organized. So when we lived with our grandparents, when our both parents were unwell, mentally unwell at one point, we lived with our grandparents for about a year. And there was that structure, that discipline, those values, they were there. And then we'd go back home and then we'd have chaos at home. And then I'd go to Ernest and then I'd have that confusion. It's a really good question that Joan asked. So it helps to explain something, again, as you say, that people don't necessarily understand.
I think there's often a tendency from people who didn't grow up traumatically, I think it's great. Kids should grow up without trauma, okay? And they should be happy and they should be encouraged and they should play and they should have friends and everything should be great. People who haven't grown up with trauma, I have found, tend to look sometimes at those who have and say, but you also say there's things you liked as a kid, so it couldn't have been that bad. But a child's brain, as you just explained, is very different than an adult brain, switching between all these different environments and all these different challenges. Some things being very structured and very good, and some things being very reliably bad, and some things being very confusing and bad. Um, it doesn't mean that you weren't traumatized, that you maybe had a moment here or there where you actually smiled, where you enjoyed a book or a movie or a cartoon. It doesn't mean that, you know? Um, before I go on, I want to say to the people who have joined, if you want to ask Patricia a question, just click where it says Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there, and I will ask her. If you don't see Q&A, click where it says more, the three dots at the bottom of your screen, and then click Q&A and type in your question. Um, I want to talk about, you talked about the child who you were angry at, right? And the child from the time of the abuse who you didn't like. Okay, and you had negative feelings about.
Mm.
Can you talk to me about the process via which that point of view shifted for you in therapy?
Yeah, a very gradual one. And as I say, it started with the photographs. And it's interesting because a lot of the conversations and the sessions weren't focused on the actual abuse. It focused on how the abuse impacted on me
Hmm.
and what I was left with from it. And over time, I mean, I saw Hilary for 6 years. There were a couple of breaks because she had ill health, but it was a 6 year period and it was intense. And sometimes she saw me for a double face-to-face session. So that was it was normally 50 minutes. So she'd give me a double session face to face. Then I would have a telephone session with her during the week. Initially, that was as and when I needed it, but then we made it planned because it worked better for me, and text contact with her in between. And I could send her emails. And when I woke up, and it was that connecting thing, I started to connect with my emotions. I started to feel the pain that the little girl within me was experiencing. I started to feel it as if it was happening to me in that moment. And I would wake up from a dream or just wake up and be hyper vigilant. I would wake up early hours. I could never tolerate crying for anyone to hear me sob or cry or see this face that my mum said was ugly when I snivelled. I couldn't tolerate that. So I would very quietly get out of bed so as not to disturb my partner. We had one adult child, young adult child living with us by then. Um, go down the stairs to the dark and I would just sob, cry. And the pain that was in my chest, here in my throat, it was like there was a rock and it was like I couldn't. And then the tears would come. And it was a long time before I actually sobbed, but I did manage to do that. And the agreement with Hilary was I phone her business phone anytime, 24/7. And I could leave a message on there. And of course, at 3 o'clock in the morning, she's unlikely to be at the other end of that phone.
Right.
But hearing her voice was the most soothing thing for me. And then leaving her a message, and it felt safe. She couldn't see me. She couldn't see the tears, or she could hear the breathlessness and sobbing, but she couldn't see my face. And it worked. So I was able to tell her what I was feeling and how terrible I was feeling. And the next morning, I would get a text from her: Tricia, I have received your message. I'm so sorry that this is how you're feeling at the moment. Remember, these feelings will pass. If you'd like to talk, I can speak between this time and that time. And that would be what she would do. So she was kind of a therapist on tap. Now, that's rare unless you pay for it. But our National Health Service, I know often people say it's the envy of the world. Well, mental health isn't very well funded. But this project I was at, called the Women's Service, was funded by Department of Health money. And it was a project. And it meant that women, it was really mostly for women, could be seen for phases of therapy. And it was taken from, actually, I think you're Judith Herman.
Okay.
You know, uh, oh, just the name of her books escapes me, but there's two books that I refer to a lot. And the model was taken from there, and it was the recovery model, which was really about people have to dip in and out for phases, that they're not one and done, that they're not fixed, and that it's a process, and that process isn't linear. And
Right.
it's like, yeah, absolutely right. But I didn't have to pay for any of those sessions whilst Hilary worked at the Women's Service. Not one. It was all NHS. When she had to medically retire and was able to only see a handful of private patients in her own home, I asked her if I could see her privately at home. And because she'd been off sick for the best part of a year, under the ethics, she was allowed to see me. And I wanted to see her. I didn't want to go back to the Women's Service to a new therapist. So I saw her for the last few months in privately. And then it had to end because she wasn't well enough to continue working. But I didn't pay for it before then. But if people are paying, they might have 5 sessions a week. And how much does that cost people?
Right.
And the UK does not offer that. The Women's Service is a unique service and it's only available in my local area. There isn't anything like that I have found in the UK, anywhere else in the UK.
It sounds like your therapist was ideally suited for that particular service.
Yeah.
Um, I have had two trauma therapists, one after the other, one who passed me to the other when she retired, which was so kind. Um, and particularly with the second therapist, what you're describing of this access, that's what I've experienced. She is unusual in that
Mm,
she's like, well, if you need to get a hold of me, text me. If you need to call me, call me. If something happens and you really need to talk to me, do that. Um, and I really am so grateful for therapists out there who are like that because I know that it's a very hard life to be a therapist and to have everybody's everything in you all the time. And
mm,
the ones like your therapist and my therapist, the past two I had, are they're just pure gold. And I don't know how they do it, but they do it. Um, we talked a little while ago about you said you had this anger that made, of course, led to you being angry at your younger self. You had this anger as you were growing up that was to a degree this outer shell that held
yeah,
in whatever the hurt was. And um, do you think a lot of your therapy or some of your therapy had to do with basically learning to allow yourself to have emotions, to have feelings about things, rather than be just stoic?
absolutely. And I describe it as being able to locate this little child within me, but couldn't reach her because there was this huge iceberg, an absolutely massive iceberg, and she was right down in the bottom of it. And I didn't know how. I started to see her, but I couldn't reach her.
Mm.
And that was incredibly powerful, and that was the hard shell. And I can remember on one occasion, I'd I can't remember actually if it was a dream or like a daydream, like an imaginary thing or an actual dream. But I remember seeing this image of a pearl, an oyster,
Mm.
and the oyster opened, and inside was this beautiful silk, and there was this small child inside this oyster. This and and it for me, it was a flash. Do you need a moment?
I'll be okay. Go ahead. This happens and I just let it be.
Okay. Um, and it was so quick. It was seconds. And my heart just in those seconds. Um, how I imagine I would have felt when I gave birth to my children if I knew how to feel. Right. I was robbed of that too, and that's
Oh.
another thing. But that feeling, well, this tiny little child was like the little pearl, which is also my birthstone.
Mm.
Um, and I phoned Hillary and I was crying and I said, I found her. I found her and she's gone. And she said, if she's shown herself this once, she's starting to feel safe and she'll show herself again. And it was just so powerful, that moment. But for me, I didn't experience it like I'm experiencing it as I'm recounting it now. I experienced anger. Why won't you show yourself to me? Why
Mm.
can't I reach you? It was that.
Mm.
And Hillary was saying she doesn't feel safe when you do that. She's frightened, and I said I'd had enough of her and I didn't want her, and I was really angry. And she said, look, you were able to grow up and leave your mum.
Mhm.
That little girl that lives within you, your little girl within, she can't grow up and leave you. She's stuck with you. So it was like, you need to do this, and I was angry with Hillary.
Mhm.
But these are the kind of really powerful things that she would say that would get me unexpectedly and always with love and compassion. It was sometimes she would sound a little bit irritated, I think, or maybe frustrated that I was I was saying what I was saying, but in a protective way to the child that's within me. Never like a judgmental, harsh way.
Mm.
It was this little girl, you know, and it took a lot for me to actually be able to feel that compassion for that little girl. And when I did, I kind of almost fell in love with her, which was an amazing feeling.
That's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. So, do you feel that you and the child have merged now? Are you one person or are you still two people?
That's a really good question, Michael. Most of the time, I feel that we're one person, but when I feel the emotions that overwhelm me, that are like a trigger putting me back where
Mhm.
I was, I kind of feel I lose the little girl within me and I have to stop, take a breath and say, it's okay, it's okay. You know, I have to really reassure that little child within me that it's okay to stay connected and together with me. There isn't a separate being. I had kept her separate, and in a way that's very small me was separate from the sexually abused me.
Mhm.
Um, and so it was kind of loving both of those little girls and and just well loving them and thanking them for somehow they got through this and they got through it by freezing and withdrawing,
Mhm.
but I was able to grow up and still be here, and I know so many who couldn't
Yeah.
be, and the fact that I could and did and have means that she's pretty cool.
It sounds like you became, and I may be reading this wrong, but in a in a small way, you became the loving parent to that little girl, to both of those little girls that little girl didn't have. Neither of those little girls
Mm,
had. And I think that's an amazing accomplishment, and I congratulate you for that.
thank
Because boy, is it hard to reconcile those different people. I've had a lot of struggle with that, and I've managed to
you.
finally um, understand myself, the child, and
Mm,
go back in my mind to those times without absolute triggers all the time. You just mentioned triggers, and of course, you're talking about that healing is a journey, right? It's not like you do it, you're done, you're healed, right? And personally, for me, healing is an ongoing journey. I don't like to say to people, I'm healed from abuse. I like to say, I'm healing all the time. And I will probably be in therapy forever. And that I don't think is a negative statement. I think that's just, I'm checking in on myself. I'm making sure I learn new things every day. I have a resource when things get difficult, which is fabulous. Um, Two parts. First of all, what kind of triggers do you still encounter? And how do you deal with those triggers?
So the triggers I encounter can be completely unexpected triggers at times, and some that I'm aware of. So um, unfairness, criticism, um, that can throw me back,
Hmm.
particularly unfairness. Um, Sometimes I just might dream about what happened to me. During therapy, I dreamt. It wasn't every night, but at times it felt like I remembered dreams every night, and I would wake up devastated. There was one in particular where I woke up and I felt like a solid cold rod had been thrust right through my body, and it was absolute agony. And I woke up in this terrible state, and I felt really triggered because all I was triggered because I was thinking, what now haven't I remembered? Why am I dreaming about something that actually didn't happen to me? And I was very distressed by that. And then I was then thinking about the things that did happen to me to try and make sense of this dream. So that was really triggering and difficult. Um, what I did then was sent Hilary a text message and said, I've had this dream. I'm confused and very distressed by it.
Mhm.
And we were on a break. It was the holidays. I was in another country, and she said to me, she acknowledged and validated my feeling and dream, um, by saying, it's telling you something, we don't know what,
Mhm.
um, and but this isn't something that you should do on your own. You shouldn't try and understand this on your own. So when we're back the following week from the break, we'll talk about it. If you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it then. Which I did. And I'd before that, I'd been looking for a word to describe how I felt about what had happened to me. And I couldn't find a word. And I was looking for um, it was like I felt like I was like a rotting flesh, like a dead body.
Mhm.
It's like, how do you describe that? Like a rotting corpse. And that's what all the badness and horror all felt like to me. But it was like I knew I wasn't bad anymore. I understood and I felt from by this time that I wasn't bad. And I was trying to find this word. And I went back to my therapy session the following week and I just said, I've been violated. That's what that dream was. And although that didn't happen to me, what I dreamt about, but it's the point that I was violated.
Mhm.
And a lot happened to me orally. Um, so and it was just the way of managing it then was I had Hilary was my support. Another way to write, and I kept a daily journal, and I would just write how I felt. There would be no I call it unconscious streaming, but I don't even know if that's really how it would be described. But it felt like I would just put my fingers on the keyboard and I can touch type and I would just start typing. I'd be typing away and then I wouldn't really be consciously thinking about what I was saying. And then I would read back what I'd written and I would be amazed. And I was in that place of total freedom to be able to just express whatever was there without knowing what was there. And one of the things that was so amazing about that is whilst I was in that kind of place of just doing what I felt, I drew a picture with my left hand. I'm right-handed. And I'm not someone who's good at art in any shape or form in terms of drawing. I mean, I could probably learn, but I'm not naturally someone who can do it. With my left hand, I sketched a picture, and it was of me around 9 or 10, sitting in the corner, in a corner of a room. Um, and it, and I just looked at it and I just, it's like, what, how? But it's that whole processing, not trying to control how I felt, just allowing myself to feel, which was very hard when I raised my children with
Mhm.
they weren't well. I did smack them when they were younger, but very rarely. And then one day I just thought this is wrong.
Mhm.
I went out of control and I just thought, oh my God, I'm like my mum. This isn't happening. And from that moment on, they were never smacked. And if you ask them, they say, well, you never smacked us. And I'm like, well, I did occasionally. No, you, well, you don't remember, because they don't have that recollection. But when
Mhm.
they were quite small, I did smack them. And um, that whole kind of experience of knowing when something feels right or wrong within me, deep within me,
Mhm.
because I'm finding myself rather than how I was raised or how my wider family spoke to and behave towards children as seen and not heard,
Mm.
do as you're told, don't have an opinion.
Yep.
Um, and so I was experiencing myself as someone quite different, but knowing that there was a lot missing, that I couldn't connect, I couldn't feel. I didn't have that look at this beautiful baby feeling when I gave birth to my three daughters. I knew I loved each one dearly, but people would be gushing and I'd think, what is wrong with them? I just couldn't get it. I didn't get it.
Mhm.
And then until I met little me in that oyster, that pearl, when I met little me then. So, um, sorry, I think I've gone off on a tangent there, um, from what your question.
That's the point, though. Let it go.
Yes,
Let it
there you
go.
go. Um, yeah, so being able to just be and allow to come what comes was one of the most beautiful things of experiencing therapy.
Do you think you said you sat at your keyboard, touch typist, just let it all come out? Do you think that in some ways um, trained you for the experience later on of writing your book?
Well, it certainly provided me with in-time material.
Hmm.
So it's how I managed. It was a combination of writing, therapy, spending time with children and grandchildren, working in a very busy professional career. It was all of those things. But writing in real time, at least once a week, if not maybe even 5 times a week sometimes, if I needed to write something or if I felt stuck or uncomfortable or unhappy, or if something I knew something was stirring and I couldn't work out what it was and I couldn't tolerate it, I used to just write. And then that over the 6 years built up an enormous journal, and altogether over 80 poems altogether. Um, 71 of those are in the book, but there was over 80 poems. And I I would, and I didn't think in my head, I'm going to write a poem. It
Hmm.
was just the strangest thing. It would be writing, and then sometimes I would write it in a paragraph, sometimes I would write it as if it was a poem. And all of that material, and my book is only part of this huge journal. I didn't talk about everything,
Mhm.
um, because it would be a huge book that might be too much. So I'm working on a second book. But um, yeah, so I had the journal. And to have the material, I don't have to reflect on how I was feeling and what I was thinking at that time to write a book. I just needed to go back to my journal. So what I did was I put every single poem into a Word document, and then I started to read my journal and cut and paste things from my journal that I felt were relevant to that process and that poem. And that's how I wrote the book. Um, and I did it over about 3 years because of the hours I worked. I had about 5 hours spare a week to actually sit and work on a book. And so I didn't have much time. But then I went on a career break and said to my partner, I want to finish this book in 3 months. And he said, right, go for it. So I did. And I used, I mean, it was already, a lot of it was already written, but there was going further through. And because Hilary had been retired on health grounds, and actually it was touch and go whether she would live, it
Mhm.
was an incredibly painful time, very difficult time. And I had moved on to another therapist within 3 months of ending with Hilary because I wasn't ready. And she was taken from me. It was like being that child that had that good enough mum. And then
Mhm.
the next day, I didn't have that good enough mum anymore. And it was kind of mirrored with that was mum's mental ill health. And this was Hilary's illness, a
Mhm.
physical illness. Um, so I was determined that I would complete the book and have it published because I was so afraid that Hilary wouldn't survive and she would never get the book. And I wanted to do it for her, to give back to her for all she had given me, which was so much. And she's still alive now, which is amazing because of advances in treatments and things, which is wonderful. She's still alive now. She's not working, but she is alive, which is wonderful. But yeah, that was my priority. It's like I have to do this. Hilary has to see this book. So
Wow. That's amazing. And what you said about her being uh the good parent, the good mother, that is so incredibly, it's such a potent thing to say. Um, we had talked previously, and you had mentioned that among those poems, there is a poem that you wrote that in some ways sums up the therapy experience in this journey for you. Would you like to read that poem right now?
yes, thank you. So this poem I wrote for Hilary on our last session. We had like a cake and tea and coffee session for her retirement session to say goodbye and just to be with each other because she didn't want to finish work and I didn't want to finish therapy. So we were both in the same boat, really, there. And I just wanted her to know how much I appreciated her. Early in our relationship, you asked me what I felt about the little girl I used to be. I couldn't feel much. You knew there was more. And with photos to help, we began to explore. When we looked back, what did we see? A wounded, shame-filled little me, filled with fear, numbed by the pain inflicted on her again and again. The little girl trapped within could do nothing more than withdraw, and there she stayed, hidden, unseen, believing she was rotten, dirty, unclean. In moments of panic, in moments of fear, at the thought of ending what we've had for years, I cry out in total despair. What will I do when I see you no more? What will I feel the dread, the cold at my core? I've been in that place before, hurting, desperate, feeling insecure, filled with self-hate, riddled with shame, believing I deserve nothing but pain, that dreadful feeling of being alone again. Then I remember in that panic and fear your words. Can you be curious? So I ask myself, does it belong to the here and now? It was how the child I now hold so dear felt existing in that bleak and scary place. No colour, no warmth, no love. I didn't know how to reach her, didn't care to know she was there. You knew she was there, listening, watching, waiting till I could show her love and care. The different, sorry, the difference you make will always be ours. The love you give, the care you show, and acceptance and appreciation I had never known. Thank you for walking every step of the way through so much darkness, so much pain, for caring, for loving, for staying, for being, for helping me understand and accept my feelings. Because of you and all you have given, I know how to play and how to be me. I've moved from existing to living and loving. I live with colour, with warmth. It's so freeing. Hilary, you, our relationship will forever be the most precious gift ever given to me.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. When you said I know how to play, that hit me really hard because I lost the ability to play because of the abuse and had to regain it decades later. And to hear that you also got that from therapy, just as I did, that means so very much. I'm so glad she was here and she is here to hear that, to read the book. I don't think there's not a better spot we could have ended on today. But we have one more question. Hold on just Joan says, clearly Hillary has given you strength through her commitment to you, but also there is so much of you that has brought you to the point you are at, brave lady.
Thank you very much, Joan. That's lovely. Thank you.
I mean, I agree with her. It takes a great deal of bravery, and I say this about all the survivors that I know. It takes a great deal of bravery to look at yourself and to go through that journey and to say, I'm going to take that journey because it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. There's going to sound pat. There's gold at the other side of it, but it's not an easy one to take. And as you said, it's been very difficult. Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up today?
Um, One thing is that my current book, I've had an issue with my publisher. So my current book is going to be unavailable quite soon on Amazon. And there's a second edition coming out, which is one that I've published with the help of my amazing editor. And and that's in colour. It's a little bit dearer than the original one. So if people did want to purchase a book, they can get the lower cost one now, but very soon that will be unavailable and it will be the colour version. But that was just so people knew because they might go on and find an unavailable book and be disappointed. But there will be another one coming out very quickly because I'm not sure of the timing of those two things. But really, to thank you, Michael, for offering this space and for being such a great voice for survivors, and you too carrying your own pain from your own lived experience. And, thank you very much.
We take this path, it's walk together, and I think that is what helps us all to heal, is that we do walk together. Even those of us who don't know each other, we're walking together.
Mm.
My friend Laura has a comment she wanted to make. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for sharing your story. And I would like to say thank you for sharing your story and for being so forthcoming, so honest, and so willing to be open today. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to wrap this up now. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Patricia. Um, I want to say, Patricia just mentioned her book, that currently you can see her book on Amazon. You go to tinyurl.com/Wennell, Wennell, tinyurl.com/Wennell. At some point, as she said, that book's going to come off, the new one's going to appear. So you may go to a link at some point that's not there, but just search the title, and because it didn't stop when it ended, and you will find her. I want to tell everybody, if you want to keep up with what we do, you can subscribe to our mailing list and visit the website at sexabusesurvivor.com. You'll get notifications about all the events that we do. Um, if for any reason you want to get in contact with me directly, that's asksurvivor@gmail.com. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, everybody out there. I really appreciate you being here, and we will see you all at the next one.